Why one specific number started appearing. The day you stopped praying for help. There was a day you stopped asking. No drama, no decision behind it. You just put the prayer down. You had asked so many times before, begged for clarity, for relief, for a sign that things would hold together. You watched for answers in every direction and found none. Eventually, the asking just stopped, quietly, without you choosing it. And that is exactly when a number started following you. It showed up on a receipt, a clock, a passing car. Not because you earned it through more effort or more pleading, because something in you finally went quiet enough to notice. This video names that number and shows why silence reached what desperation could not. Right now, you only need to know this much. The sign did not arrive despite your surrender. It arrived because of it. What it means, specifically, comes next. The day the asking stopped. You did not announce it to anyone. There was no final prayer, no dramatic ending. You simply stopped reaching for an answer that never came. For a long time before that day, you had been asking constantly, almost on a loop. You asked in the car, in the shower, in the quiet minutes right before sleep, hoping somewhere in the repetition an answer would finally surface. You asked for clarity about a relationship, a decision, a future that felt completely unreadable from where you stood. Each time you asked, you braced yourself and waited for something, anything to shift in response. Nothing did. Not once. Not in the way you needed it to. Eventually, it was not the wanting that wore you down. It was the waiting itself, the constant bracing for a sign that kept refusing to arrive on schedule. You kept performing hope the way you had been taught to, repeating the same request with the same quiet desperation, telling yourself that repetition would eventually be enough to earn a response. It never was, no matter how sincerely you meant it. Here is the part most people miss about that moment. The asking did not stop because you lost faith. It stopped because your nervous system simply ran out of the energy required to keep begging. That is not collapse. That is a body protecting itself. Psychologists call this extinction. When a behavior produces no result for long enough, it fades, even if the desire underneath stays fully intact. You did not stop wanting an answer. You stopped performing the asking that wasn't working. There is often a final burst of intensity right before that fading sets in, one last desperate push before the behavior finally quiets down completely. If you remember asking harder than ever in the days right before you stopped, that burst was simply the process finishing. It was not a personal failure on your part. Athletes describe something similar right before an injury finally forces them to rest. The body pushes hardest in the final stretch, almost as if trying to outrun the exhaustion, before it finally gives way to the rest it needed all along. Your asking followed that same arc. What nobody tells you is what happens in the silence right after that. The asking stops, but attention does not disappear. It just changes shape. Instead of scanning for relief, you start scanning, quietly, for meaning. You notice details you would have rushed past a month earlier. This is the part that matters for what comes next. The day you stopped asking was not the day you gave up. It was the day your attention finally became still enough to notice something that had likely been there all along, waiting for a moment when you weren't begging loudly enough to drown it out. That stillness is exactly when the first sign appeared. Not as a reward for patience. As a result of quiet. You will recognize the shape of it the second I describe it. A specific number, repeating in places that should have been random. It did not arrive to comfort you in the way prayer usually promises comfort. It arrived to answer something you had stopped expecting an answer to. The next part names it directly because there is no reason to make you wait any longer than you already have. The number that answered instead. 3 days after the asking stopped, you noticed it for the first time. A receipt, printed at 7:17 in the evening, sitting on the counter where you almost never looked twice. You glanced at it and felt something small catch in your chest, the way a name catches when you hear it unexpectedly in a crowded room. You told yourself it was nothing. Then it happened again, on a clock you passed without meaning to check it. Then again, on a license plate at a red light, then on a jersey number a stranger wore at the gym. The number is 7117. 717. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Here is what it means on its surface, stated plainly, because you have waited long enough for this. 717 is widely understood as a number of faith without proof, of trust that does not require constant reassurance to remain steady. It tends to surface for people who have just stopped demanding certainty before they are willing to keep moving forward. This kind of trust looks unremarkable from the outside, almost ordinary. There is no visible transformation, no dramatic before and after. What changed was internal, quiet, the kind of shift that only becomes obvious once you notice what stopped happening around you. Friends and family rarely comment on this kind of change because there is nothing visible to comment on. You did not announce a transformation. You simply stopped reacting to uncertainty the way you used to, and almost nobody noticed except you. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. You did not start seeing it while you were still pleading for evidence. You started seeing it the moment you released the need for evidence entirely. The timing is the message, not a coincidence riding alongside it. This is where most explanations stop and where this video keeps going. Because knowing the number is faith is only the surface layer, the one you can repeat to a friend in a single sentence. The deeper layer is about what faith without demand actually requires of a person, psychologically, and why almost nobody is taught how to access it honestly. Most people think faith means waiting quietly for proof to eventually arrive. That is not faith, that is delayed doubt. Real faith, the kind 717 tends to mark, has nothing left to verify because it stopped needing verification as its condition. You stopped needing the proof first. The number showed up after, almost as confirmation rather than as bait. That order matters, and very few people ever notice it happened in that sequence for them. Before this goes further, it is worth being honest about something uncomfortable. Begging for a sign and receiving silence is not a punishment. It is often the exact mechanism that clears space for the sign to be noticed at all. That idea deserves its own full explanation, and that is exactly where this goes next. Why begging closes the door. It's knocking on. There is a strange contradiction nobody talks about openly. Begging for help is supposed to be the most honest position a person can take. And yet, again and again, it seems to be the posture that receives the least response. This is not because pleading is wrong or weak or somehow disqualifying. It is because of what desperate asking does to attention. When you beg for an outcome, your focus narrows almost completely onto the absence of that outcome. You scan only for the thing you are missing, which means you filter out almost everything else happening around you. Psychologists describe a version of this as tunnel vision under stress. Under high emotional pressure, the brain prioritizes threat detection and need fulfillment over peripheral awareness. It is a survival mechanism, useful when you are actually in danger, much less useful when you are searching for a quiet, subtle sign. A repeating number is, by definition, a peripheral signal. It shows up on a clock you are not staring at, a receipt you are not studying, a plate on a car you are not trying to read. Tunnel vision, by its very design, filters exactly that kind of detail out before it reaches conscious awareness. Think of how easily you miss a familiar song playing quietly in a busy store while you're focused on finding one specific item. The song was there the entire time. Your attention simply had no room left to register it until the searching stopped. The same thing happens with a clock on a wall you pass dozens of times a day. Most of those passes leave no trace in memory at all. Only the rare moment when attention is wide enough actually lands and gets remembered afterward as if it had appeared from nowhere. So when you were begging the loudest, you were also, without knowing it, the least equipped to notice the sign you were begging to receive. That is the door closing on itself, not from outside punishment, but from the shape of desperate attention. Here is the part that changes everything once you understand it. The moment desperate asking stops, attention does not vanish, it simply widens back out. Peripheral details that were filtered out for weeks suddenly become visible again, almost overnight. That is not mysticism. That is basic cognitive science layered underneath a spiritual experience. The number was very likely appearing the entire time. You were simply not in a state that could register it as meaningful. This reframes the whole experience in a way that should feel like relief rather than guilt. You did not fail to notice sooner because you weren't paying attention. You couldn't notice sooner because attention itself was occupied elsewhere, doing exactly what desperate need asks it to do. Knowing this changes how you treat the silence that came before. That silence deserves a closer look of its own, because it was doing something far more useful than it felt like at the time. The silence before the sign. Silence in moments like these almost always gets misread as absence. You ask, nothing answers, and the natural conclusion feels obvious. Nobody is listening. Nothing is happening. You have been left to figure this out completely alone. That conclusion is understandable, and it is also incomplete. Silence is not the same as nothing happening. It is frequently the exact period where the most important internal shifting takes place, quietly, without announcing itself the way a clear answer would. Think about what was actually happening underneath your asking during that stretch of time. You were exhausting an old strategy, the strategy of pleading for certainty before moving forward. That strategy had probably worked, or seemed to work, in earlier seasons of your life. This time it simply stopped producing relief no matter how sincerely or repeatedly you used it. A strategy that stops working eventually has to be abandoned, but abandonment rarely happens in one clean decision. It happens gradually, through repeated disappointment, until the old approach finally loses its grip. That gradual loosening is exactly what the silent period was doing, even though it felt like nothing was happening at all. There is something else worth naming directly. Many people interpret a long silence as a sign they are being ignored or even punished for asking too much. That interpretation adds shame on top of an already difficult waiting period, which makes the waiting heavier than it needs to be. A more accurate reading is far less punishing. The silence was clearing the exact channel that desperate asking had been blocking. Once that channel opened, the sign did not need to shout to be noticed because you were finally in a position to actually receive it. This explains something many people experience but rarely name out loud. The clarity that eventually arrives after a long silence often feels disproportionately calm, almost too calm for how big the question felt. That calm is not a coincidence. It is what happens when an answer reaches a mind that has finally stopped bracing against it. It can almost feel anticlimactic at first, like the answer arrived too gently for how much you suffered waiting for it. That mismatch is normal. Relief rarely matches the intensity of the struggle that preceded it, and that is not a sign the struggle didn't matter. In fact, the gentleness is often the clearest evidence that something real shifted. Loud, dramatic relief tends to fade quickly, while quiet relief that simply settles into you without fanfare tends to be the kind that actually lasts. Understanding the silence this way removes a layer of guilt that tends to sit quietly underneath spiritual waiting. You were not failing during that stretch. You were finishing something necessary, even though it did not look like progress from the inside. What this number specifically represents underneath the surface, meaning already given, goes even further than faith alone, and that deserves its own full explanation. What 717 actually means. It would be easy to stop at the surface definition already given and move on. Faith without proof is true, but it is also the version of this meaning that fits neatly into a single caption. The fuller meaning asks for a little more patience. Numerologically, 717 combines two distinct energies sitting on either side of a single number. The 7 represents inner knowing, the kind of understanding that arrives through reflection rather than external confirmation. The 1 in the middle represents a fresh starting point, a decision point, a moment where direction matters more than certainty. This structure is not arbitrary. The repetition of the 7 on both ends suggests the knowing was present before the decision and remained present afterward. It frames the 1 in the middle as a single honest choice surrounded by steady awareness rather than confusion. This is different from numbers that simply repeat the same digit 3 times. Those tend to mark intensity, a single energy amplified. 717 instead describes a sequence, a beginning and an end that quietly confirm each other across a single decisive middle point. Together, the pattern describes a very specific sequence rather than a vague blessing. Inner knowing first. A decision born from that knowing second. Inner knowing again, deepened by having acted on it once already. It is less a message of comfort and more a description of a process you have likely just lived through without naming it. Look back at your own sequence for a moment. You reached a quiet form of knowing, the sense that pleading was no longer the right approach. You made a decision, even an unconscious one, to stop performing desperate hope. And now you are back in a state of knowing, except this time it feels steadier, less reactive, less dependent on outside reassurance. That is the shape 717 is pointing toward. Not faith as a single feeling, but faith as a completed cycle. One that started and ended in trust, with a real decision sitting in between. There is a reason this number tends to appear specifically during seasons of surrender, rather than seasons of striving. Striving is loud, demanding, focused entirely on outcome. Surrender is quieter, focused instead on alignment, on whether your direction matches something steady inside you, rather than something urgent outside you. People who see this number while still actively forcing an outcome rarely report the same emotional resonance as people who see it after they have stopped forcing. The number does not reward effort. It tends to mark the specific moment effort gave way to trust. This raises a fair question worth sitting with honestly. If trust is what allowed you to notice the sign, what exactly changed inside you to make that trust possible in the first place? That mechanism, the actual psychological shift underneath the spiritual language, is what the next section unpacks in full. The letting go effect. There is a documented psychological pattern that explains a large part of what you experienced, even though it rarely gets connected to spiritual signs directly. Researchers sometimes call it the paradox of effort, the observation that intense striving toward a specific outcome can actually reduce a person's ability to perceive relevant information around them. This happens because effort consumes cognitive resources. The brain has a limited capacity for focused attention at any given moment, and when most of that capacity gets spent on wanting and pushing, very little remains available for noticing subtle, ambient detail. This is the same reason a person searching frantically for misplaced keys often overlooks them sitting in plain sight. The frantic searching itself, ironically, becomes the obstacle to seeing what is right there. The same pattern shows up when trying too hard to recall a name. The more forcefully you chase the memory, the further it seems to slip away, only to surface effortlessly minutes later, once you stop trying entirely. Letting go, in this framework, is not passivity. It is a redistribution of attention. The mental energy that was previously locked onto forcing an outcome becomes available again, free to notice things that effort had been crowding out entirely. This explains something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it named clearly. Many people report their biggest insight, their clearest sign, or their most meaningful coincidence arriving shortly after they finally stop trying so hard to force a resolution. It is not mystical timing alone. It is attention finally becoming available again. There is a closely related concept worth bringing in here, because it sharpens the picture further. Psychologists describe something called the rebound effect of suppressed thoughts, where actively trying not to think about something often makes that thought louder rather than quieter. Begging works in a similar way toward an outcome rather than a thought. The more forcefully you chase a result, the more that chasing dominates your inner experience, leaving less room for anything else to register. When you stopped asking, you were not abandoning the desire underneath the asking. You were releasing the forceful chasing that had been drowning everything else out. The desire stayed intact. Only the desperate grip around it loosened. This is why letting go so often gets misunderstood as giving up entirely. They look identical from the outside. Both involve stopping an action, but internally they are almost opposites. Giving up closes the door on wanting. Letting go simply opens the hand around it. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Confusing the two can make people feel like they failed at faith when they actually just succeeded at trust, and that confusion deserves to be cleared up directly. Why it showed up where you weren't looking. If you trace back every place you actually noticed the number, a pattern starts to emerge that most people overlook completely. None of those moments happened while you were searching. All of them happened while you were doing something else entirely. You saw it on a receipt while reaching for your keys, not while checking the time on purpose. You saw it on a license plate while distracted at a red light, thinking about something unrelated. You saw it on a stranger's jersey while your mind was somewhere else completely, focused on getting through the gym, not on watching for signs. This pattern is not a coincidence of bad luck or good luck. It reflects something specific about how recognition actually works inside the human brain. Active searching engages a narrow, goal-directed kind of attention, the same kind that filters out anything unrelated to the search itself. Passive noticing, by contrast, uses a wider, more relaxed kind of awareness, one that catches detail without filtering it through a specific goal first. Spiritual signs, almost by definition, tend to surface through this wider kind of awareness rather than the narrow kind. This is also why signs so often appear in ordinary, unremarkable moments rather than dramatic ones. Wide attention does not wait for significant scenes. It simply stays open during whatever is already happening, which is usually something small and forgettable. A receipt, a license plate, a stranger's jersey are not chosen for their drama. They are simply available, ordinary surfaces that happen to be present the instant your attention finally widens enough to take them in. This is why telling someone to actively look for a sign so often backfires. The instruction itself activates the narrow searching mode, the exact mode least capable of noticing something subtle and unscheduled. You cannot force this kind of recognition by trying harder to watch for it. What you can do, and what apparently happened for you without realizing it, is create the conditions where wide, relaxed attention becomes available again. That happens specifically when urgent searching stops, when the nervous system settles enough to stop scanning only for relief. Once that wider attention returns, signs that may have been present all along finally become visible, not because they intensified, but because your capacity to register them did. This reframes the entire experience away from luck or mysticism and toward something closer to readiness. You were not lucky to notice it where you weren't looking. You were, for the first time in a while, actually capable of noticing anything at all outside your immediate need. That capability, once restored, tends to stay available, which matters for understanding what this shift means going forward. The difference between giving up and letting go. This distinction deserves a full chapter of its own, because confusing it has likely caused you unnecessary guilt somewhere along the way. From the outside, giving up and letting go can look exactly the same. Both involve stopping an action that used to define your days. The difference lives entirely on the inside, in what remains after the stopping happens. Giving up leaves behind resignation, a quiet conviction that the outcome you wanted is now permanently out of reach. It often comes paired with numbness, a flattening of feeling toward the thing you used to care about so intensely. Letting go leaves behind something noticeably different. The caring stays fully intact, often even sharpened, while only the desperate grip around the outcome relaxes. You still want clarity, connection, resolution, whatever it was you were originally asking for. You simply stop demanding it on a fixed timeline, through a fixed method, before you are willing to keep living your life. Ask yourself honestly which one describes what happened to you. Did the caring disappear, or did only the desperate reaching disappear while the caring quietly stayed? Most people who later report meaningful signs describe the second version, not the first. This matters because spiritual traditions across many cultures consistently describe surrender as an active, alive posture rather than a passive collapse. Surrender is not numbness dressed up in gentler language. It is full awareness of a desire, held without the grip that exhausted you while you were chasing it. You can usually tell the difference by checking whether you still feel anything when you imagine the outcome you wanted. Numbness produces a flat, distant feeling. Genuine surrender still produces warmth, hope, even longing, simply without the urgency attached to it before. If picturing that outcome still brings a small ache of hope, that ache is proof the caring never left. It is simply quieter now, no longer shouting for resolution, which is exactly the posture that tends to invite recognition rather than push it away. The number you have been seeing tends to favor exactly this kind of surrender over either extreme. It rarely appears for people who have gone fully numb, because numbness filters out subtle detail just as effectively as desperate searching does. It also rarely sustains for people still gripping tightly, even quietly, underneath a calm exterior. It tends to keep appearing for people sitting in the narrow, honest space between the two, still caring, no longer gripping. If that description matches where you actually are right now, the sign is not confirming an ending. It is confirming a posture, one worth protecting as you move forward from here. What changes next, internally rather than spiritually, is worth naming clearly, because the shift goes deeper than most people expect once they stop demanding an answer on their own terms. What changes the moment you stop asking? There is an internal shift that happens the moment desperate asking finally stops, and it goes deeper than simple relief. It changes what psychologists call your locus of control, the internal sense of where influence over your life actually sits. While you were begging for an outcome, your sense of control sat almost entirely outside yourself. You were waiting on a sign, a person, a circumstance, something external that needed to move before your situation could improve. That arrangement leaves a person feeling powerless by design, because power was never placed inside them to begin with. People who live for long stretches with an entirely external locus of control often report higher anxiety and lower resilience, regardless of how things actually turn out. The relocation that happened inside you was not just emotional relief. It was a measurable shift in how your mind handles uncertainty going forward. This shift tends to be self-reinforcing once it begins. Each time you tolerate uncertainty without collapsing back into desperate asking, the new pattern strengthens, making the next uncertain moment a little easier to sit with than the one before it. The moment you stopped asking, even without realizing it, you quietly relocated some of that control back inside yourself. You decided on some level that your peace could not keep waiting on an external answer that wasn't arriving. That decision is small in the moment, but it restructures how you relate to uncertainty going forward. This restructuring shows up in concrete, noticeable ways. Decisions that used to feel paralyzing start to feel merely uncomfortable instead. Silence that used to feel like rejection starts to feel like simple absence of information. Nothing more dramatic than that. You also start tolerating ambiguity differently. Before, not knowing felt like danger, something that had to be resolved immediately through more asking, more checking, more reassurance seeking. Now not knowing can sit beside you without demanding instant resolution, which is a genuinely rare emotional skill most people never develop deliberately. There is a reason this shift tends to coincide with noticing spiritual signs more often. A nervous system no longer locked in emergency mode has far more bandwidth available for subtle perception. Calm attention notices more than anxious attention ever could, regardless of what is actually happening around a person. This means the sign did not create the calm you are feeling. The calm, arriving first through letting go, created the conditions that allowed the sign to finally be noticed. Cause and effect run in the opposite direction from how it usually gets described. Understanding this order changes how you should treat moments of doubt that may still surface occasionally. They do not undo the shift that already happened. They are simply old patterns passing through a nervous system that has already, mostly, moved on from needing them. What this means for your faith going forward, specifically the quieter version of it that does not depend on constant proof, is where this naturally leads next. The quiet kind of faith. Most descriptions of faith focus on certainty, as though faith means feeling completely sure that everything will turn out exactly as hoped. That version of faith is fragile, because it depends entirely on outcomes lining up the way you expected them to. There is a quieter version, less discussed but far more durable. This kind of faith does not require certainty about outcomes at all. It requires only a steady trust that you are not navigating your life entirely alone, even when no specific answer has been handed to you yet. This quieter version rarely gets celebrated the way dramatic breakthroughs do. Nobody tells stories about the day they simply stopped panicking. But it is this unremarkable steadiness, repeated quietly over time, that ends up shaping a person far more than any single dramatic moment ever could. It accumulates the way small daily habits accumulate, almost invisibly. One day you notice you are simply a calmer version of who you used to be, without being able to point to the exact moment it happened. You have likely already been practicing this quieter version without naming it, since the day you stopped asking, You have continued moving through decisions, conversations, and uncertain situations without demanding proof first that everything would work out. That is the quiet kind of faith in motion, not the dramatic kind that gets described in stories. This version of faith does not announce itself loudly. It does not produce constant chills or overwhelming certainty. It shows up instead as a slightly steadier breath before a hard conversation. It shows up as a willingness to wait one more day before forcing a decision, a sense that you can survive not knowing for a little while longer. The number that has been following you tends to reinforce exactly this version, rather than the dramatic certainty version many people expect from spiritual signs. It rarely arrives shouting an answer. It tends to arrive confirming a direction you had already, quietly, started trusting on your own. This distinction matters for how you treat future moments of doubt. If you wait for overwhelming certainty before trusting yourself again, you may wait indefinitely, because that kind of certainty rarely arrives on command. If instead you recognize this quieter, steadier trust as legitimate faith in its own right, you stop waiting for a feeling that was never actually required. Faith without demand does not mean faith without feeling. It means feeling fully present, caring fully, while no longer requiring proof as the price of moving forward anyway. That is a harder, more mature posture than constant certainty, and it is the one this entire experience has been quietly building inside you. What remains now is naming clearly what this number is specifically asking you to carry forward, so the insight does not fade the way most realizations eventually do once daily life resumes around them. What 717 is asking you to carry forward. Every layer of this has led somewhere specific, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than left abstract. The day you stopped asking was not surrender in the defeated sense. It was the exact moment your attention finally widened enough to notice what may have already been there. The number did not arrive because you finally pleaded correctly, or long enough, or with the right words. It arrived because the pleading stopped, and underneath the pleading, trust had quietly already started. That order, trust first, sign second, is the part most people get backwards. Carry that order with you, because it will matter again the next time you face uncertainty. The instinct will return to ask louder, to search harder, to force a timeline onto something that refuses to move on command. When that instinct returns, remember what actually worked this time. It was not more effort. It was less gripping, paired with attention that stayed fully present rather than going numb. That combination, caring without clutching, is rare, and you have already proven to yourself that you are capable of it. This number is not promising you that every future outcome will resolve the way you hope. It is confirming something quieter and, in its own way, more useful. You do not need certainty handed to you before you are allowed to keep moving forward with steadiness. The asking stopped, and something answered anyway. Not louder than the silence, but exactly loud enough to be noticed by someone finally capable of noticing it. That capability did not leave when the moment passed. It stayed, available to you the next time you need it. Whatever uncertainty you are carrying right now, even something unrelated to this exact situation, can be met with that same posture. Not louder asking, not more gripping. Just enough quiet attention to notice what is already trying to reach you. That posture is not a one-time trick reserved for this particular moment in your life. It is a skill, available again the next time something feels unresolved, and it tends to get easier to access each time you choose it, instead of falling back into old, desperate asking. If you take only one thing from everything explored here, take this. Faith was never about forcing an answer to arrive faster. It was about becoming someone capable of receiving it the moment it finally did, without needing to grip it first to believe it was real. You already proved you could do that once. That is not a small thing, and it will not be the last time it matters.